All right. So today we're going to talk about plastic trees. That's fun. Um, so yeah, obviously, if you didn't necessarily recognize it from the readings for this week, right, with the Willows and fake plastic trees, we're going to take a more ecological approach to our topic today. Um, and don't worry, we're not just going to talk about how cool or creepy trees can be, depending on who's actually writing about them. Um, but yeah, I think it is interesting to consider, right, the ways in which stories inform the actual way that we envision the world around us, right? Rather than the world around us informing stories, right? Which is usually the way that we see things, or we tend to imagine, um, the work of, or the dynamics of literature, I should say, in the world. Um, so yeah, did anyone, by the way, just purely out of curiosity, did anyone also listen to the Radiohead song "Fake Plastic Trees" while reading the short story? Yeah. Okay, cool. Did you find any like overlap between the two? Just you did? Oh, cool. We can maybe talk about that later. Anyone else listen to Radiohead just in general? No. You should. They're pretty good. Hot take, right? They're only one of the most interesting bands to come out of the late '90s. They're awesome. You should check them out, even if they're British. Yeah. So today we're just going to be looking a little bit at a bit of eco-criticism, and for some reason my notes are not showing properly with this. So give me a sec to actually do it properly. Mm-mm-mm. Here we go. Okay. Um, all right. So the whole purpose, right, for today's class, um, is to kind of parse out, right, what we mean by eco-criticism, because I think people have some idea just with the term eco-criticism what it might imply, right? It's pretty standard in the actual name, ecological, and criticism, right? You could either go in the direction of criticism of ecologies or its portrayal of ecologies, or the way that ecologies can allow for a particular type of criticism. Okay, um, but obviously this means something different, entirely different, actually, depending on when you actually take a look at these eco-critical perspectives, right? Because you can argue that they go back all the way to at least the 17th century, right, in an explicit fashion, as, the world is, as we've mentioned in this class before, simultaneously getting bigger as, people are more and more aware of different parts of the world. But also smaller in the sense that it's easier to travel to those parts of the world without too much difficulty, starting with the 17th century onward. So obviously that shift, right, in the way that we actually encounter planet Earth or the place that we live on generally or live in generally can definitely have an impact on, right, the perspectives that we have on the environment. Um, but of course, there's probably some argument to be made that there's always been some level of eco-criticism that appears in literature, right? I'm sure if you dig deep enough in Plato, you can find some eco-critical sentence somewhere, right? He produced enough writings, or at least someone wrote down his writings enough that you would find something probably. You certainly find it in early English texts like Beowulf, right? So there's some level on which there is an awareness of the power of the environment and power of the ecology to actually enact some kind of literary perspective, right? The reason why most people typically begin it with the 17th century, right? Or more fully, right, with the advent of the Romantics at the end of the 18th century, with 1789 onward, is mostly because there's a deliberate approach to ecology and environment, right? Usually, the way that people approached it prior to the 17th and 18th centuries is as a byproduct of just being in planet Earth, right? We exist on this rock that's floating in space. So naturally, sometimes we'll talk about it, right? But what you start to see again with the 17th and 18th century is that we are actually trying to understand that, right? And trying to articulate it in a particularly insightful and powerful way. Right? And so, right, that's where you see the advent of the Romantics, right? Which, you get to see me swear in Quebecois now. But right, did I show you Mont Blanc in this class before? No? Some of you might have seen it a little bit. Right. We're just going to look at this first stanza here because it's a rather long poem, but it gets at what I'm talking about, right? With the shift of the way that we actually approach the world around us, right? No one before, or very few people before writers like Shelley, maybe perhaps someone like Dryden before that, would have actually addressed something like a mountain, which Mont Blanc is an actual place, right, that you can visit. Yeah, it's not exactly the same Mont Blanc as Shelley would have been writing about. Obviously, climate change has had an impact on the way that he perceived it versus how we perceive it today. But, nobody writes about mountains like this before the 17th or 18th century, right? The everlasting universe of things flows through the mind and rolls its rapid waves, now dark, now glittering, now reflecting gloom, now lending splendor where from secret springs the source of human thought its tribute brings, of water with a sound but half its own, such as a feeble brook will oft assume, in the wild woods among the mountains lone, where waterfalls around it leap forever, where woods and winds contend, and a vast river over its rocks ceaselessly bursts and raves. And I know I talk about the Romantics a lot in this class, right? I'm firmly aware of that. But there's a reason why they are important as a literary movement is because you do see a rather important signal shift in the way that we approach literature from then onward, right? Which it's very hard to dissociate ourselves from. But right, just with this first line, who can imagine a mountain, right, in relation to the everlasting universe of things, right? Things is a word that we kind of take for granted now, right? We kind of assume it as part of our regular English vocabulary, right? Or French vocabulary, if we said chose, right? It would be a very normal word. But when you put it in relation to something like the everlasting universe, right, and something like a mountain, it takes on a whole different meaning. It's simultaneously mundane, right, things, right? This water bottle's a thing. It's mundane. It's something that you see every day, but it's also something that taps into something incredibly vast, right, like the universe, right? It's something that's tied into the very fabric of the world, at least according to Shelley. Right? And so I think really that is where we can kind of see a signal shift towards, nope, I don't want to open my emails, towards eco-criticism, right? Or at least an ecological perspective in literature. Because I say ecological perspective in literature because eco-criticism, right, as we talked about in the first class, involves the actual analysis of ecology, right? Which you see, again, a little bit of just by the fact that writers are aware in the past of these things that they're trying to do in literature. But it really becomes an academic approach with the 80s and 90s, right? You see a boom in academia of texts that actually try to understand and theorize and systematize this thing that we call the ecology. Okay? And what's kind of interesting is that a lot of these texts kind of come down on a very interesting perspective, which is there kind of isn't a way to systematize ecology, right? It's kind of a foolhardy errand. And any way that we actually do try to systematize, say, this planet, is inevitably channeled through our very specific human perspective, which on the one hand is normal, right? Humans are the ones who are actually performing this method of analysis. But what might be the problem of channeling the world through our human perspective, right? Why might that be an issue for some people? Yeah, Adam.
It's not man-made.
Okay, so it's not human-made on the one hand, right? The world, as we know it, long predates any kind of human intervention, right? Or even human existence, right? What else? Mm-hmm.
It's too big.
It's too big, right? At the end of the day, right? We are technically a part of nature, right? Humans kind of evolved out of whatever primeval soup that existed hundreds of thousands of years ago or millions of years ago. And eventually we kind of became, self-obsessed and, depressed people sitting in a classroom in the 21st century, right? That's the kind of step of evolution. It goes fish, hunter-gatherer, depressed, sad people on their phones, right? That's the 3-step program of humanity. Regardless, right, of how we actually engage with that today, we're ultimately a very, very small part of this wide planet. Right? This is not something that is particularly new as an insight, right? I'm sure you're all firmly aware of this. But that's one of the things that ecocriticism does tend to think about, right? Whenever, for example, environment or ecology is brought up in a piece of fiction or a piece of literature, whatever it may be, how do we actually imagine it? And what a lot of early eco-critics noticed is that we often tend to imagine it through the perspective of through an anthropocentric perspective, what we call anthropocentric perspective. So human perspective, anthropos, human, centric, centered, right? Human-centered, which of course can be a rather difficult thing to actually get away from, right? As humans actually producing literature, okay? And this is something that people from across the world have actually done, right? This is not particular to one kind of community or one type of literature. This has been done in all kinds of fashions. But on the flip side, you also see a slew of literatures from across the world that do actually try to engage with what we call the non-human, right? Last week, we were talking about post-colonial literatures, right? That's something that you see in a lot of post-colonial literatures, for example. Just to come back to the example of indigenous literatures that we focused on last week, you see that in a lot of indigenous stories, right? A focus on how animals had an impact on the creation of the earth, or these spirit gods, for example, that stand in for some natural phenomenon. You see this going all the way back to Greek literature, right? The gods stand in with something else, right? You see this in African animist traditions, for example, right? All of these places do have some kind of storytelling tradition that has at least attempted to get at what the non-human is, right? Although even that can be rather I wouldn't say problematic, because it's not necessarily. It offers us the opportunity to problematize that, right? It's not without its opportunities for criticism when someone does try to understand something like the non-human, right? How do you even start that? Right? How would you write a story from the perspective of, I don't know, a rock, right? Or a snowy owl. It's possible, right? People have done it for many, many years, millennia, but it does force a reconsideration of our own subject positions, right? Of our own place in the world, of our own place in the universe, so on and so forth, right? So one of the things that you might have noticed in what I'm saying so far is that eco-criticism does tend to bring together or is getting at many of the ideas that we've already talked about in class so far, right? It is a very postmodern type of criticism in many ways. It's a criticism that simultaneously is firmly aware of its position as a form of criticism, which is a very postmodern thing to do. But it's also very postmodern in the sense that that Frederick Jameson imagines it as a form of criticism that picks and chooses from all kinds of other forms of criticism and kind of pastiches it into a new form of criticism, or a criticism that that has a specific perspective, despite the fact that it comes from all kinds of different backgrounds, right? I already mentioned post-colonial criticism, right? That's often one way that post-colonial literature dissociates itself from its colonized position, right? Is by decentering the human, right? What a lot of post-colonial writers tended to notice is that the colonized literature that they were taught in school, for example, tended to have a very anthropocentric focus, right? And again, that's not to necessarily discount the power of those literatures. Some of them are genuinely quite good. We gave the example of Heart of Darkness last week, right? Despite its problems, it's an excellent text. Or even something like Shakespeare's The Tempest, right? An extremely ecologically conscious text, but one that is, again, very anthropocentric, right? At the end of the day. And so what a lot of post-colonial writers noticed is that, hey, these texts that were being taught or given or that we're taking as assumed, right? We can challenge that by taking a different perspective on that story and decentering the human, right? Where does the non-human fit into this, right? Or we can even push it even further. One of the things that we talked about last week was how colonized subjects were often dehumanized, right? Made unhuman, right? And that was an easier way to actually control them, dominate them, right? Make them less than, right? That was one of the things that we talked about. And so one of the things that you see in post-colonial literatures is that they take up this status, right, as other, right, or non-human, and say, okay, let's shift it on its head and make it something positive on our own terms, right? And so you go from post-colonial to perhaps something that we might call eco-post-colonial, which is a very awkward term. I don't think it's going to stick, but that's the kind of thing that you can perhaps imagine. Right? You might take a psychoanalytic perspective, right? What effect does this have on our mind, right? Or the ecologies that we live in, the environments that we live in? It has a huge impact on the way that we perceive the world, that we perceive ourselves. Right? We gave the example a few weeks ago. Was it a few weeks ago? I don't remember when we gave that example, right? Of being in nature versus being in a city, right? Just that shift, right, in our consciousness and our awareness has a major difference, right, on how we perceive ourselves, right? I know personally I'm more at peace when I'm in the country outside of Montreal, right? As much as I love this city, it's a fantastic city in many ways. I feel more calm and rested outside of the city, right? Yeah. Yeah. Please.
You consider colonization as post-colonial?
Unfortunately, you won't be able to write an essay on that, but it would be a good essay topic. I will say. No, absolutely not. Yeah, I think you're absolutely correct. It is something that we brought up briefly last week, which is why I kind of glossed over it. But yeah, you're absolutely right. So Conrad is someone who simultaneously was very critical of one form of colonialism, right? Heart of Darkness was written specifically in response to Belgian colonization in the Congo, right? Which, if any of you want to look into, it was a particularly brutal form of colonialism, right? As if there was a tame version of colonialism, but you know. But at the same time, I think you're right because Conrad was a British national, right? And he perceived the British Empire as a liberal type of empire, right? A good type of empire. So he made a distinction between the bad Belgian Empire and the good British Empire. And because he still saw some forms of empire as benevolent in some ways, I think you're absolutely correct. He still falls into that colonized trap of othering someone else. Yeah, like the Congolese. Yeah, yeah. Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah, for sure. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it talks about how, like, he's kind of different from the other one, but he also like diminishes them as like less than humans.
Yeah, absolutely right. I think you're 100% correct. And Echeve's essay is one that we brought up last week as well. No, it's fine. You weren't there. It's okay. But I think I'm just mentioning it because I'm saying that you're correct here. So yeah, I actually did almost give Heart of Darkness. I think I mentioned this before. I almost did give Heart of Darkness as a reading in this class, not because it is weird fiction in any way, shape, or form, but it does have some of those qualities that that can be applied to post-colonial weird fiction that we talked about last week. Right either in the writing, right, or in the othering of people, or even in the way that it depicts the space of the Congo, right, as this weird and untamed land, right, in a very problematic way that is unfortunately also very aesthetically beautiful, right? Like he was a technically good writer, right? And that's obviously the major dilemma with any writing like that, right? Yeah, I don't know if I answered your question or not, but I think I did. Okay, good. Okay, so where was I? Yeah, so like I said, eco-criticism kind of pulls from all of these perspectives. There is a reason, though, why it kind of emerged as a form of criticism post-1990, right? Or post-rather 1991, really establishing itself in the academy as a thing, right? So far we've been focusing on post-World War I as a turning point for a lot of criticism, and I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. When we talked about, we briefly mentioned post 9/11 world when I gave the example of like structuralism and terrorism, but why 1990s, right? What happens in the world post 1990 that might be a good shift? Yeah.
The USSR falls.
Okay, so the USSR collapses, right? Another example of something that we could spend a lot of time problematizing, right, as a thing. But the Cold War was a very interesting period of time that I think had a huge impact on the way that we understand ecologies, right, or willingness to engage with the world around us. One of the major criticisms that places like the USSR or any other type of broadly speaking anti-capitalist movement, right, whether it was the Soviet Union or any other type of movement, one of the broad criticisms that they had against capitalism, bless you, throughout the Cold War was its rather extreme exploitative practices, right? That's the basis of any kind of left-wing critique, right? Or its extraction policies. This is something that we brought up, again, briefly last week. Capitalism, as we know it, relies on constant extraction, right, of resources from anywhere, in the world, right? And this is not me just necessarily throwing my political baton around. That is literally just how the system functions, right? It requires constant extraction of resources from somewhere in order to produce commodities, right? And despite the many problems that an institution or a nation like the Soviet Union had, the way that a lot of people perceived it, right, in a more abstract sense, was as some kind of counterbalance to the capitalist world, right? For all its problems, it did offer some imagination or some imagined, I should say, view of the world than just the one that we see in Western capitalism, right? And post 1991, of course, that dissolved, right? For a variety of reasons. This is not a history class. We're not going to get into it. But it dissolves for many reasons. And all that's left in the world is Western capitalism, which we're still living in today, right? Pretty much everywhere across the world, that is the type of world that we have, right? And so eco-criticism kind of comes in around this time and says, one of the places that we can actually intervene on a critical level is by saying or establishing to what extent this extractive world that we live in, that is foundational to our political, social, and economic system, right, approaches nature as one of those resources, right, and how literature either enforces that perspective on literature, on nature as a resource, or can either attack and antagonize this perspective on nature as a resource, right? And it becomes a lot easier to do that when the entire world operates under that system. Right? Hold on to this idea of like critiques of capitalism. We're going to come back to it after the March break because China Miéville is someone who's firmly invested in that, both as a writer and as a just personal entity, right, as an individual. So hold on to that in the back of your mind, right? So even if we haven't talked about it yet, eco-criticism not only blends post-colonialism, psychoanalysis, structuralism, but as we'll see in a few weeks, Marxism as well, right? Or any kind of left-wing critique of capitalism, right? So again, it's this very pastiche-like form of criticism. Right? While I take a sip of coffee, does anyone else have questions so far? Okay. One of the last connections that I want to make to something that we've alluded to in this class so far, but that I think is integral as well to eco-critical perspectives, is feminism, right? Feminist critics are often intertwined, especially in the contemporary era, with eco-critical perspectives. Out of curiosity, does anyone know why that might be? Or take a shot as to why that might be? What's the relation between women or feminism, feminist critiques, right? It's not just women, but feminist critiques and eco-critical critiques. What connection might we make with that? Sure, Adam.
They're both questioning an aspect of the world.
Okay, so there's certainly like the critical stance, right? Is one that you can absolutely make, right? They both tend to want to critique some form of established society, right? Feminism tends to aim its criticism at patriarchy, eco-criticism at the way we relate to nature, right? Great. We can go even further than that. You might have seen this in some literature classes that you've taken, right? In the way that we tend to imagine women, right? That's where the overlap might be. Yeah?
They know all this. the exploitment of them.
So on one hand, right, the exploitation of women is something that that a lot of what we generally call ecofeminists, right, have taken up as an idea, right? This has gone back all the way to like the 70s, I would say, right? You really see this emergence of this form of criticism. But again, it really establishes itself from the 80s onward, right? So for those of you who didn't necessarily hear, right, a lot of ecofeminists might have this perspective that women's bodies, right, as bearers of children, for example, are exploited or engaged with in exploitative practices and extractive practices, much as we would nature, right? In the same way, again, to bring it back to the post-colonial criticism that we've brought up before, colonized subjects tended to be right portrayed right as exploited, right, or as exploitable, I should say. We can go even further than that in perhaps the semiotics of women. That's perhaps an odd term, but you know. So you'll notice in a lot of old literature, actually, let's see if I can find it here. Hold on. It's not literature, but is it okay? No, shoot. Who's the famous Renaissance painter? Crap. His name starts with a B. With the woman in a clamshell painting. Do we know? No. Okay, hold on. I'm gonna kick myself for woman in shell. Yeah. Okay. Hold on. That's not the name of the painting. Birth of Venus. There we go. Okay.
Oh,
That's it. Okay. We're there. We got there. Okay. Sorry about that. Who's Botticelli? It was not Boccaccio, Botticelli. I knew there was a B in there. The worst part is I've actually seen this painting in real life. And yeah, couldn't for the life of me remember. Okay, maybe if we look at this painting, that'll trigger some response here. So obviously, there's a woman in the center, and one on the side. What might we say about the women in this picture? The woman in the middle is Venus, by the way, right? Typical image of femininity as represented by the shaving products, Venus, right? How are we depicting women in this painting?
It looks like subject of admiration.
Okay. On the one hand, subject of admiration, right? That is definitely something that a lot of eco-critics and ecofeminists will pick up on, right? We tend to simultaneously admire nature for its beauty, but we admire a very specific type of nature. To bring it back to literature, if any of you have read the Margaret Atwood short story, Death by Landscape, she kind of brings this up. The idea that what we admire in nature tends to be quote unquote landscape, which is a organized form of nature, right? It's not naturally occurring, because naturally occurring nature is chaotic and unruly, something that has volcanoes and causes, right, massive climate catastrophes on a whim. Whereas when we tend to imagine beautiful nature, it tends to be a deliberately organized form of landscape. And a lot of ecofeminists will say that's very much like how we imagine women, right? The perfect woman is not an unruly woman, but one that follows the rules, right? There's something else. Just look at Venus herself in the middle. What is she standing on? A shell. Good. What is the other one? I don't remember who the other woman is on the side. What is she surrounded by? Trees. Good. A lot of women throughout literature, right? And men as well, like humans have often in literature associated themselves, right, with some kind of natural element, right? On a symbolic level, from a literary perspective, this is a very normal thing to do, right? You want to create images in people's minds, and so you associate it with something that people might be aware of, right? But what a lot of ecofeminists noticed, right, with the 70s and 80s onward, is that the semiotics of nature, right, the images of nature that we tend to associate with women themselves tend to be ones, again, of docility or passiveness and beauty, right? Whereas the images of nature that tend to be associated to men, right, tend to be ones of strength, power, right, and so on. And both, by the way, are problematic in many ways, right? I don't know about the other guys in this classroom, but I wouldn't necessarily associate myself with a powerful horse or a volcano that explodes, right? Like, I just don't, right? I don't imagine myself that way. So it does set like different standards for people, right? And that's where a lot of the ecofeminist criticism comes in, right? Is to question these images and ideals that are perpetuated through things like this admittedly gorgeous painting, right? Or, for the purposes of our class here, literature. Just to bring it back to the example that you brought up, you see this in Heart of Darkness as well, right? The way that the Congolese people are very much tied into a specific idea of untamed and savage nature, right? You see this all the time, okay? If ever you are in Venice, go see this. It's fantastic, right? It's actually a lot bigger than I thought it was, right? It's huge. It's about the size of the projector screen, right? Incredible thing to see in real life. So yeah, when you're casually in Venice, just chilling, Florence, sorry, just chilling, you should go see it. Okay. So, I can close Mont Blanc. I had something else that I wanted to mention. Yeah, a little peek behind the curtain that I have notes on. Yeah. So I think that pretty much, just looking at my notes here, pretty much covers everything that I wanted to touch upon as far as introduction to eco-criticism is concerned, right? But I hope you're already starting to see, right, a little bit of why this might be important for the literature that we're talking about today, right? We're going to mostly focus on fake plastic trees, just because I think it's the better of the two stories, right? Although I do like the Algernon Blackwood, the Willows. I, again, find him to be a very good writer in many ways. But yeah, especially in the fake plastic trees one, I'm sure you're already starting to see at least some connections with what I'm saying here, especially with the way that it ends. So, as usual, right, if you wanted to summarize what I was saying, you can sum it up in like a couple of these questions here. On the most basic level, right, how is nature represented? There's nothing wrong with this type of question, right? You can do so very easily and have a pretty good essay actually come out just of this rather broad question. But again, it is, as I just said, rather broad. But all of the other four questions do kind of extend from, if we will, those perspectives, or that broader question, I should say. So how do the characters relate to nature? For example, how do they interact with the natural world? So, the fake plastic trees one or the Willows both have characters that engage in very, very different ways with the nature around them, okay? For different reasons, of course. But this is something that you can start to think about, okay? I wrote down here as well, how does ideology function in the work's representation of nature? So I gave the example of capitalism here, but you can really fit in any ideology, right? ideology, we all know what I mean when I say that. Ish, right? Basically a system of values, right? We were talking about psychoanalysis a few weeks ago. Psychoanalysts are very, very interested in ideology, right? What are the structural systems that inform how we operate in our day-to-day lives? Okay, sometimes in very obvious ways, and sometimes in not so obvious ways. Okay, that's why I gave capitalism as an example, right? It is literally the structure and system that we live in, and the way we act in our daily lives has an impact, right? That is directly rooted in this. For a feminist, patriarchal systems are an ideology, right? Because it informs the way that both men and women operate to themselves or within society. And the list can go on and on and on, right? Imperialism was seen as a form of ideology, is seen, right? Neocolonialism, so on, so on. And it's not necessarily negative, by the way, right? I took some negative examples here. But usually, at least from a critical perspective, we do tend to take, shot at things that are a little bit more negative just because it's more straightforward as a method of criticism. And as I just mentioned with the Botticelli painting, right? How is nature represented in terms of gender, right? And as an extension of that, how is nature represented in terms of race, class, or even cultural identity? Okay. Cultural identity is a big one, actually. We see that here in Canada quite a bit, actually, right? We tend to imagine that being Canadian is engaging with the Great White North, right? This snowy and cold and harsh place, right? Being able to withstand great temperatures throughout 4 or 5 months of the year. If that's part of being Canadian, I'm the worst Canadian imaginable. I cannot stand any kind of cold, right?
Thank you.
Yeah, okay, thank you, Adam. Right, so I'm making a joke about it here, but the idea of nature being associated to cultural identity is something that's seen again throughout the world, right? When I was in Italy, you did see something very similar, right? To pick back up on the Botticelli painting, where specific regions had a specific tie to whatever nature or whatever landscape was present in their area. Right? So all that to say, right, that these are the main questions that are going to be driving our perspective and our criticism of these two stories going forward. Okay. I will be showing you a little bit later some of the more specific questions that I came up with in relation to the two short stories. But I think broadly speaking, these are the ones that you can focus on, especially in relation to next week's test. Right, one of these questions is going to be up next week in our exam. Okay. One of these questions is going to be on the exam, perhaps. Right? In case that wasn't subtle enough. Okay. So, because we have, that only took about 45 minutes, so that's good. Does anyone have any questions before we move on? I'm getting good at this, at like summarizing these perspectives in a relatively effective way. Okay, good. Before we take a break, okay, I want us to be all on the same page of what the short stories are, right? Have we all read The Willows, at the very least? Yeah? Okay, good. So let's start there. Who wants to give my voice a break and tell me what exactly is The Willows about? What would be a summary of The Willows? Yeah, Mia. Two dudes going down a river. Yep.
Across like this swampy area with the wind fields everywhere. And we camp on there and we just have these really bad feelings. And when you arrive, you see like a dead body, but they're like, I don't remember, it's another. And they see a man in a boat. And then they're like, it wasn't a man in a boat.
So the world seems to be playing tricks on them in a way. You think it's one thing and then it's another. Okay. Good.
Then they realize that the region there is some sort of like not portal, but these script is like the veil between Earth and like something otherworldly in or there, so there are like other beings there.
Yeah.
Like trying to find them.
Yeah, good. Which is, by the way, something that, for those of you who read The Wendigo last week, Blackwood did a similar thing in The Wendigo. The trees become a kind of, or the dark trees become a doorway, or he describes it as a kind of doorway for, in this case, the Wendigo, but yeah, absolutely. Were you finished? Okay, no, it's fine if you had more to say. Does anyone want to add to, what are the characters in The Willows, right? So you said two guys, right? What can we say about those two guys? What are they like? What, do we have their names? Carlos?
Some reason about it, but
Yeah.
at the beginning of the culture, narrator talks with the other about my companion. At the end of the story, he calls him his friend. So all of them have like a bond of what they got.
Yeah, there seems to be like some kind of traumatic bond happening. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Do they both have names? I wouldn't ask the question if the answer was yes. Yeah.
I mean, he calls his companion the Swede.
The Swede, yeah. Do we have a name for the narrator? I don't remember there being one, actually.
It's kind of, but I don't remember.
Yeah, exactly. So at best we have national identities, right? Maybe something to consider in thinking through that story. Anything else we want to add to the Willows? Yeah, Minhee.
So at first, even though like they sense things, like especially the companion, he like sees very like nonchalant and doesn't seem to notice anything. But in the end, it seems like they have to hide their fear in order to survive.
Yeah. Okay, so there's an emotional regulation that's happening there. Again, think of the two main characters here. Are they men or women? It's not a trick question. Yeah.
They're men.
They're men. Okay. Maybe it's something to think about in relation to how they deal with their emotions, right? Again, not necessarily like the most in-depth thing, but it is the type of thing that you can think about for an early 20th century story like this one. Okay. And, you know, especially with question number 4, right? Okay. So there is a bit of regulation of emotion going on. Yeah. Mia, you mentioned like the barrier between realities. Do we know anything about what's in that other reality, right? There's little descriptions here and there, but like, do we know anything concrete about what comes through? I said you, but like anyone can answer this question, right?
Repeat your question?
Yeah, sure. I can repeat the question, right? Like these boundaries, right, that are like being crossed over in the Willows, right? Do we know anything about the other reality that he's talking about? Like what's in there, right? No, not really, right? There are some descriptions that he kind of gets at here and there, but it's very abstract, right? Vague, yeah, very much. Good. Okay, so hold on to all of this. We're going to come back to them after the break. And what about fake plastic trees? Who wants to give me a summary of that one? Go ahead, Adam.
Forgot what her name was.
Cody?
Cody, yeah, Cody.
she was writing I think a diary, but sort of like emptying out her thoughts
Mhm.
on some pieces of paper they found.
Yeah.
On the she was talking about like an event that happened to her like a year ago.
Yeah.
And very quick summary about it would be she was told not to cross a gated fence that got abandoned because there was nothing on the other side. People considered suicide,
Mhm.
but she still did anyways because teenagers.
Yeah.
And when she got on the bridge. She found a car that wasn't supposed to be there,
Mhm.
and then she found a mother and her daughter. The daughter was a child. Doesn't matter. Child,
Mhm.
just having been turned into the plastic goo by the micro machines and nano machines. And about she found the baby, but that sequence was actually a dream because she dreamt that the baby died in her arms, but she actually did manage to save him, and it's still growing at the end of it.
Okay. You mentioned very briefly, right, the nanomachines. What is all of that, right?
Yeah, it was an experiment. It was an experiment because like
Mhm.
overpopulation, way too much overpopulation happened, and so scientists were trying to make a completely self-renewable like source of food,
Mhm.
but got out of control extremely fast, and it tried turning everything into this gooey plastic.
Good. Yeah.
Yeah.
Has anyone here, by the way, seen this very good summary, by the way? Has anyone seen the David Cronenberg movie Crimes of the Future? Okay. If you liked fake plastic trees, you're gonna love Crimes of the Future. It's not like your typical Hollywood movie necessarily with like a clear like good guy, bad guy kind of thing. It's like a body horror microplastic movie. It's fantastic. David Cronenberg is a Canadian gem in filmmaking, and you should definitely check it out. If anyone's looking it up, it's the recent version. He made two movies called Crimes of the Future, one in the 70s and one in 2022. But yeah, the 1970s one is good, but it's a totally different movie. It's not a remake of each other, so just go into it knowing that. It's incredible. Okay, you're arriving right on time for the break. So take a few minutes, take a 10-minute break or so, and when we come back, we'll actually answer questions about the short stories. Okay? Nice.
That's the picture.
I'll mention it at the end in front of everyone, but you'll have your notes.
Fast notes.
Yeah.
If I was an archive, would you print them out?
I'm going to be circulating anyway, so no, you don't have to. You can keep.
Even if our books are on the iPad,
Yeah.
that's okay. Because I did all my books.
Yeah, it's fine.
But I think all the short stories are online.
Yeah, exactly. They're all online.
I guess we just have them. But
You can just leave my head. It's fine.
okay.
God, deny books.
No, I'm going to just have the end.
Yesterday?
It was good. I quite liked it actually.
Fun.
Yeah, I didn't know what to expect.
Did you leave early? I
No.
didn't see you exit. Okay.
No, I went. I was out just before the kind of interview.
Oh, right.
Actually to go drink some water and then a little like talk.
Let's talk.
Yeah, no, it was really good. I didn't. Yeah, like I said, I didn't know what to expect going into it. Right, I just had the little blurb on the website.
Yeah, same.
But yeah, I thought it was well thought out, well constructed. I like their use of space
Me too.
quite a bit. It was quite good. So yeah, can't complain. Yeah.
I like it. And the little halo light every time you prayed.
Yeah,
And
the
the back of Jesus light
Yeah.
every time. Yeah, that was good too. That was funny. I think that both plays we watched so far have been really good. I really like the musical too.
yeah,
That was
yeah.
probably my favorite.
Okay, good.
And then are you coming to Julius Caesar on March 6th?
That's the one at Dawson, yeah.
Yeah.
March 6th. No, I'm in Philadelphia.
Oh, so it's gonna watch that.
Um, I've seen Julius Caesar before. It's fine.
Yeah, probably, you know, a little bit, like, not that the Dawson kids are not good, but, you know,
Yeah.
probably better with, you know.
Yeah, but it's I have nothing against college productions of plays. But they're very hit or miss.
Yes.
Yeah, it can either be really good or they completely fail.
I watched another one with, actually,
Yeah.
Professor Maxwell at home. I want to say like a year ago,
Hmm.
we watched. What was it?
Was it much ado about nothing or something? Was it much ado about nothing?
No, it was another Shakespearean one, but I'm thinking, what was it? I forgot, why am I having, I don't know. It was also a Dawson College, but I don't know if you went to that one, but
As you like it.
they were like a Canadian outfit, like Jean Top and Jean Pants.
Yeah,
For a Shakespearean play. Yeah.
Okay.
Very interesting.
It's a choice. Okay.
Oh, I was also good.
Oh, that's Antigone's not Shakespeare.
Okay, sorry, not Shakespeare.
Okay.
This, but yeah, it was also good.
Okay.
That's what we went. That's what we watched, and it was also the Canadian outfit. And I thought that was really interesting, and that was my first play ever.
Mhm.
So I had like, so when I went to watch, I went to watch like Kiernan
Yep.
with Professor Borrow last semester.
Mhm.
And that one was really good, but it wasn't as good as Strawberries and Canary. That's still my favorite.
That's good.
Yeah. And the yesterday of that one was really funny. I felt like I was like watching my girlfriend's fight, you know?
Awesome. Well, what are the other? So it's Julius Caesar, and then is that the last one that you're seeing?
Yeah, that's the last play. But that's like she said it's really heavy, so that's why we don't have any other stuff to watch.
Have you ever read the play before?
Well, we had to go for like class, but not yet. It's after Mark break.
Yeah, I guess it's heavy in a political intrigue type
Well,
of.
she's Shakespearean, so I'm scared, you know, for
Like, yeah. Have you ever seen like a political thriller or something like that?
maybe.
It does have a bit of those vibes, right? It's like it's called Julius Caesar, but spoiler alert: if you know anything about history, Julius Caesar does not live. Sorry. So it's you can think of it as like a political intrigue in that sense. It's like there's a conspiracy against Caesar, and it's the whole political
Political, yes.
Yeah. So there is violence insofar as like again spoilers
I
for
mean,
history.
Professor Maxwell's really excited about it.
Yeah, he gets stabbed.
Okay.
Like, that's just what happens to Caesar.
You're also
Many times,
Shakespearean, right?
No, but I like Shakespeare because he's cool. Yeah. Sorry, Adam, what was your question?
You got stabbed many times?
Yeah, many times, exactly.
But what's your PhD consist?
I'm in, I study CanLit and Indigenous Lit. So,
Sorry, Canadian.
CanLit and Indigenous Lit.
I took Canadian lit with another teacher. I forget his name, but
William?
yes.
Brubaker, yeah.
Are you guys, do you know each other?
Yeah, he just finished his PhD actually.
Okay, so
Yeah.
he was still a student when he was teaching us.
Yeah.
He was really good too.
No, he's fun. We're actually co-presenting in Toronto a piece together this summer. But yeah, so I'm looking specifically into literature in the 1920s and 30s. in
Okay.
The priorities.
Oh, nice.
Yep. That's fun. How much time do I have left? Okay. Does anyone here in English like ever get the feeling that you order too many books? Like, or is it just me?
Nope.
Like, I just keep getting notifications for books that I'm getting, and I'm like, when did I order this? Right? Is that only me? Liam, you have like an eyebrow up as if it's like I'm crazy right now. Please confirm that I'm not the only one that this happens to, right? You used to be like that. Okay. Yeah. It does help that I'm a teacher and I can get books for free. So like, yeah, it's weird. So yeah, Kemi's getting very mad at me for ordering too many books. All right. Is there anyone missing? Let's get started again. Which do we want to start with? The Willows or fake plastic trees? Plastic trees? Okay. Okay, so we gave a bit of a quick summary, right, of fake plastic trees. This techno-organic virus, right, spreads across the world and turns everything into all caps the goo, right? Which sounds like something out of a pulp 1950s movie, right, with a low budget, but that's also kind of cool. And yeah, it's basically the adventures of Cody in this world. Okay. Just to start us off, right? What were some of our initial impressions of this story? Right? What were some of the things that came out to us or that we thought were particularly interesting? Yeah, go ahead, Adam. I'm just asking this while I'm actually opening up the text. Yeah, go for it.
I thought it was written like in a way that you can tell she's writing this not professionally
Okay.
at all, and she's kind of forced to by.
When you say she, who are you talking about?
Cody.
Okay.
Yeah.
I thought you were talking about the actual author for a second.
Oh no.
Listen.
No, that's good. Yeah, she feels kind of forced.
Okay.
Or to write it, and obviously she's using very teen lingo that they would have at that point.
Yeah. Yeah.
And, yeah.
When you say at that point, when does the story take place?
I think was it about 2016? Because the US began happening in like 2048.
Yeah, in like some kind of in the not too distant future.
Yeah, because she said, I remember she said 12 years, like it happened 12 years before she was 15.
Yeah. So yeah, somewhere around 2016, that would make sense. Yeah. I was just looking for it. Okay, so I like this idea, right? Of she seems kind of forced to write this thing, right? Or it's not necessarily forced, like you say, but an obligation, right? Some kind of moral obligation. Why, and anyone can answer this, why would Cody have this moral obligation to write something down in this world? Or write her story down, or a story, right? Why might this be important in what I'll broadly call the apocalypse, right? Because it pretty much is, right? The world as we know it ends, right? Which, by the way, do we know? Technically, apocalypse is not the right term, right? Do we know where apocalypse comes from? Like, we have the modern version of it, which is technically the end of the world. But do we all know where it might come, where it actually comes from, or what it actually means?
It's probably like maybe 1984.
No, it's way further than that. Anyone who's read the Bible here, just out of curiosity? Yeah, Liam, what's the last chapter of the King James Bible? Anyone know?
Is it Judgment Day? I don't know.
It's Judgment Day.
It's Judgment Day.
It's not called Judgment Day because that's the title of Terminator 2, but no, it's Revelation, right? And that's what apocalypse literally means, is revelation, right? To reveal something. It's just that what also happens in that chapter of the Bible is that the world falls into pieces and demons pop out from the ground, right? So people have associated apocalypse with the end of the world, but that's not what it actually means, right? It means revelation. So actually, I think we can use the term apocalypse both in the modern sense of apocalypse for this thing, but also in the traditional sense of revelation, right? I think Cody in many ways actually does try to have revelations about the world around her, or has some form of revelation about the world around her and herself. throughout the story, right? So I think, just on a dual perspective of the term apocalypse, this can very much be the case. But yeah, just to come back to my non-tangent question, why is writing important in this story for Cody?
Why not?
Why is writing important,
Oh.
right? Sorry, for Cody, right? Just to come back to that original question. Yes, Mia.
You deal with her trauma. Then there's like the feeling of obligation to leave like the story behind for the future generations. Because like, nobody like right now what happened. She says, oh, there's already people who wrote it down probably better than me, but yeah, she feels like she needs to write it.
So there's, right, healing and posterity, right, for the future. Yes, Adam.
Yeah, and in the posterity thing, there's also like the lab paper.
Okay,
Like the
good.
few sheets she has as like the few non-books, like already written books, the piece of sheet. So she wants to make use of them.
The irony, right, that goes on, right? Or it's rather ironic in the story, right? Because what does the techno-organic virus, like, that's spread out, right? What does it do? What does it transform the world into? Plastic, right? What do we know about plastic? If there's one thing that we know about plastic, is what? What's the quality of plastic, right? Why that would make it ironic for this story? Yeah.
Non-biodegradable.
Yeah, it just sticks around forever, right? It is an eternal substance, which brings up the irony of what you and Nia were talking about, right? Where on the one hand, the world is kind of collapsing, right? And everything is shifting away from what we expect it to be. But it's doing so by literally solidifying into this eternal substance, right? Into this plastic, artificial world that intuitively we would say is eternal, right? Would go on forever. Plastic, as we know, just takes 1,000, 2,000 years to dissolve. It doesn't matter, right? It's on a time scale that is so long that it's irrelevant. And yet, right, the one thing that Cody does want to actually do for the sake of posterity is write down on a piece of paper, which in this plastic world is the most biodegradable thing possible, right? It's the one thing that's actually going to kind of collapse, right? Because paper does collapse a lot more than plastic, right? Or at least it goes bad a lot faster than plastic, right? So there's a kind of irony there that's happening, right? And this gets at one of the things that we didn't necessarily bring up last week, but that is interesting to at least keep in mind, not necessarily in this story, but just in general, is this idea that that writing is eternal, right? Which is kind of a myth, right? On one hand, yes, right? You're writing something down and you're actually putting it on some kind of physical object, right? But at the same time, we have access to maybe 1% today in the 21st century of everything that's ever been written down, right? Most things that have been written down, we have no access to anymore because either libraries have been destroyed, right, throughout history, or paper is just biodegradable, right? Floods happen, right? So it is actually kind of interesting to think of the environment, and this is, I think, something that Kiernan is bringing up in her story, the environment as something that, by its very nature, the environment and its nature, that the environment by its very nature does encourage the degradation, right, of some form of writing, okay? So I don't know. I don't know if there's anything to like unparse about that. I just think that the irony here is kind of interesting to think about, right? Okay, good. What else did we make of this story, right? Any other interesting things that stood out to us, right? Either about the virus or the writing? Yeah.
The self-imposed guilt.
Okay, self-imposed guilt about what?
Really, she has had for a year
Mhm.
since that ended, but because for some reason in her mind, she sees herself as having killed the child by having given it the water,
Yes.
but it actually lived in reality.
Mm-hmm.
So for some reason, she imposed this own trauma on herself.
Why does that stand out to you? Why is that important? Why might she have this trauma, perhaps?
Don't exactly get it.
Okay. Does anyone want to attempt an answer at that? Mia, go for it.
Doomed into live in this world that probably won't last long.
Dooming a child. And you see this all the time, right? It's, I'll be an open book here. This is a conversation I've had with my partner, right? The ethics of having a child in a burning world, right? Like, we laugh, but it is a valid conversation, I think, to have, right? How many of you have actually thought of that, just out of curiosity, right? Like, how good it might be or bad it might be to actually have a kid in 2025, right? Good, okay. For those of you who haven't, good for you on being healthy, I guess, in your mental health. So that's good. But I think you're right, Mia. Right? That is the type of questioning that might be happening here with Cody, right? Of what world are we bringing people into, right? Should we bring a child into this world, right? What else do we make of the child, right? Either as a character or a symbol or, yeah. Hope. Okay, so on the one hand, hope.
Along with the fact that it has this sort of like, I don't know if it's innate or if it got acquired by its mother, because apparently she was a scientist that was working on it before it happened.
Mm-hmm.
She might have found something, but died.
Yeah.
But she still gave it to her child. So, but it's a symbol of hope.
Okay, so symbol of hope. Classic symbol of hope in literature, right? Children. For those of you who have read, what's it called? They made a movie about it with Children of Men. Thank you very much, right? Children of Men. See, this is why I lecture to people. You know my pop culture references. Children of Men. How many of you have actually seen that one? So obviously, Naiva, you have. Really? None of you have seen it?
I've heard
Phenomenal movie with Clive Owen, which, my dude, Clive Owen, absolute heartthrob of a man, especially circa 2004 Clive Owen. Incredible. But you should absolutely watch it. It's really interesting. Heart-wrenching of a movie, right? You probably will cry watching it because it's an emotional roller coaster, but in a good way, right? It is worth watching. But they do get at that hope of, a child, right? And what you would do to actually bring a child into an actual broken down planet, right? And it's not like a fake plastic tree planet. It's like a literal, annihilated planet in this case. So these questions are very much at the forefront of a lot of writers' minds. What else do we make of the kid? Especially in relation to Cody. And maybe where she finds it. Take a minute to think about that one. Yeah.
there's a lot of layers, I think, in that question. Because there's a lot.
Good. It's intended to have layers,
Yeah.
yes.
And I think the main thing that would be the unnatural aspect,
Uh-huh.
or maybe accidental aspect even. Because first of all, the world became like this because of an accident.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Second of all, she wasn't supposed to be there.
Okay, good.
Third of all, the car wasn't supposed to be there. Fourth of all, the bridge wasn't supposed to still be there.
So you're pointing at something in particular, right? Where usually something like a child would, well, not always, but usually, right? People intend to have children, right? Obviously, accidents happen. Just ask my mom. But no, I was fully intended. But right. Sometimes accidents happen, of course, or happy accidents, we'll call them. But generally, children are intended, right? But as you're pointing to, Adam, I'm sorry, did I break you, Minidzi? It's Friday afternoon for everyone, after all. Yeah, so but there are these layers of accidents that happen for this child to actually come into the world, right? Because on one level, had these accidents not happened, likely the child would have died, right? Like the actual birthing process, quote unquote, of this child would not have happened were it not for entire accidents, which is the complete antithesis of how we imagine birthing as a thing to occur. And yet it is also exactly how birth occurs, right? Technically, you are all alive because of accidents, right? Like, to come back to that, like, evolutionary standpoint, right? The accident of, or the statistical accident that life on Earth is possible, that some organism walks onto land millions of years ago and evolves into a human being that survives for enough generations that your parents can actually, meet each other and, have you as a child, right? That is a series of accidents that happen, right? So it's simultaneously exactly how we imagine humans to just emerge as human beings, and also completely antithetical because it's in a fake plastic world, right? So there are these interesting dualities that definitely happen in this story. Let's push that further. What else is interesting about the child? Maybe someone other than Adam. Nothing against your answers. Your answers are great so far. But think about where it was found, right? The car. Why is that interesting? Symbolically speaking. And you can think about it, by the way, in relation to perhaps the third question. Either the second or third question might actually give you a hint as to why that might be important.
I feel very interested in finding out child is alive because I first guessed that all of the family was dead, but it's very unexpected thing from so
Right.
I feel very thrilled and interested.
So the family's dead, right? And yet the child survives, absolutely, right? What else? Why is the car important? Think of 21st century North America. And in this case, that's straight up, I think, question number 2 here. When I say question 2, I mean this. Yeah.
It's just like, do you mean because cars right now are like is polluting, creating like
Keep going.
climate change.
Uh-huh.
It's messing up the environment and everything.
Now we're cooking with gas. Let's go.
And now there's this car that she finds, and there's a kid. I don't know.
I think you're going on something, right? So again, this is a story of like bizarre contradictions, right? Simultaneously, things like the car, which we brought about in other classes, right, are an explicit cause for the problems that we're facing today as far as environmental degradation, right? It's not only the car, but the car is certainly like a stand-in for a lot of the problems that we have environmentally speaking, right? It's like a gas guzzling type of machine that the very production of causes all kinds of environmental problems, right? And is firmly associated with what a lot of you are expressing as a lack of interest in actually having, or at least a difficulty with having children, right? Or a reticence to have children, perhaps. And yet is literally, if we want to think of it that way, a kind of birthing pod for the future generation, right? But the reason why I pointed to question number 2 as well, right, is what we often see in these worlds of environment, or these stories of environmental degradation, and what you often see, by the way, today in just society, right, is a form of nostalgia for the past, right? And to rebirth, right, or to have some kind of new society be formed from an imagined past, right? To take a really problematic example, right? And I don't think that people who actually made this slogan thought of it on this level, but I do personally believe that it comes from that innate feeling. Make America great again, right? Obviously, well, at least I find it personally horrendous as a movement, right? Someone in this class can feel free to disagree with me if you feel that way, but I find the idea horrible. But the sentiment that they're getting at, right, is one of nostalgia, right? One that imagines, or in this case, literally imagines a past that never existed for the majority of people, right? And want to build a future based on this imagined past, right? And you see this as well, to bring it back to the image of the car, right, birthing the future. You see this with things like electric cars, right, the way we talk about them. Electric cars are good, right, in some ways, but they're not going to save the world necessarily. It's not going to be the thing that's going to suddenly solve climate change, right? And so we're attaching ourselves to these images, right, like the car, and yet trying to build a new future based on this nostalgia that the freedom of cars actually imagines, right? So I do think you're absolutely getting to something, Mia. Yes, Sue. Greenwashing is very much in that line, yeah.
Electrical car, like it's not so much better, but
Yeah. Who here is in the reading fiction class? Yeah. Okay, most of you. Good. Yeah, I think last Monday you talked about the Tamarisk Hunter. Yeah, green capital. Who can explain what green capitalism is to me? Right. You talked about it in class, I know, because we also talked about it at supper time on Monday. So, yeah.
actually helping the environment.
Yeah.
It's like this, like, it can be like in cosmetics or whatever, like
Yeah.
just making it seem like, oh yeah, this is made with 95% natural ingredients. And so you're like making money off that, but there's no such thing as natural ingredients.
Exactly. Right. I don't know if they brought up the example, right? But this is a really good one. How many of you know what a carbon footprint is? Just a show of hands, right? Carbon footprint. Okay, good. Who knows where the slogan comes from? You don't know? It was literally created by an oil company. BP Oil actually came up with the idea of the carbon footprint, right? As a way of putting the blame on each and every one of you, right? We're not the problem, BP Oil. You individually are the problem, right? And if you make a change in your life, you can help solve climate change. We, BP Oil, do not have to change a single thing, right? I'm being a little bit cynical about it, of course, right? I do think like we generally do have a little bit of part to play as individuals, right? But that gets to the heart of like this idea of green capitalism that you were raising, right? This idea that we can continue on with the world as we know it, in some way, shape, or form, but just tweak it a little bit in order to make it just a bit greener, and everything is going to be okay. Yeah. So I do think there is a little bit of a critique of that in Fake Plastic Trees as well, in her use of the car, right? Symbolically speaking, right? Okay. Why is the plastic important? We'll go there. And this, I would say, ties into the first question. Is this a degraded, artificial, or absent a world where nature is degraded, artificial, or absent? So why is plastic here important? Yeah.
Ironically, it can't be degraded because plastic is undegradable.
Right.
So I would say it's artificial, but it's also absent because like over 80% of the world is over 80% of the world, including the people, is just gone. So I think it's artificial and absent, but not really degraded.
Right. Do we all agree with this? Does anyone want to elaborate on this? So, oh yes, go ahead, Maiva. Yeah, please.
Explain it perfectly.
Which page? Cool.
Slide is number 6, but it's written the plastic degrades and then crumbles. It's finally nothing but dust that the wind blows away.
Yeah, I'm trying to find it. There it is. Yeah, the plastic degrades and then crumbles and is finally nothing but dust that the wind blows away. So yeah, it does fit in, right? Again, with this contradiction. Again, plastic, it does eventually, like even plastic that we know today will eventually kind of collapse, right? Everything collapses at the end of the day, right? Concrete, glass, anything, right? So it does actually kind of beg the question, is it a part of nature at that point? When does it become a part of nature? Because it will collapse and hell. Actually, think about that for a sec. I have another point that we can add on to it. Does it eventually become part of nature? How do we understand nature? Is nature just something that grows and is green? Or is it part of our environment? Yeah. Okay.
Well, I don't want to sound like but it's like it comes somewhere, it has a origin from the ground. It's like, I don't know how to explain it honestly, but I think for plastic, I don't know.
Yeah.
I understood. Technically, although we transformed it, it was something natural before. That, because I look, if I do not invent nothing, plastic come from. Like,
Plastic is from petrol, and where does petrol come from? Fossils. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's fossils that degraded. We talked about this. Yeah.
took it so
Yeah.
from nature,
Yeah.
then we transform it, which put the imprint of man-made, then because of our involvement with it,
Yeah.
it can no longer go back naturally by itself, but we can still, we have ways to get disintegrated, but it's still gonna leave prints, like footprints
Yeah.
on like on the surface of the earth, and will still affect generations to come for the years.
Good.
And the way.
So in a way, like it comes from nature in many ways, right? Degraded fossils becomes, this. The once mighty T-Rex, ladies and gentlemen. Right? Becomes the things that we have around us. And we're starting to see, just to come back to this idea of cycle, which I think is really good. How many of you here have heard of microplastics? Right? Okay. Where do microplastics end up? I'm probably like 25% microplastics at this point. Like, I don't know. I don't know to what extent, right, we actually go into it. But it is literally, right, starting to integrate back into everything that we eat, right? There are studies now that it's in the food. Hell, probably the healthiest thing on earth that we have, right? Water probably has microplastics in it, right? And in some way, life goes on, right? Like, obviously, it's not perfect, but, and I would rather have microplasticless water, generally speaking. I think that would be a good thing. But there's a sense in which, right, plastic has kind of become a part of our environment, whether we like it or not, right? And I brought up the movie Crimes of the Future before the break, and it does kind of raise that question in a really interesting way of where does human biology go to and human evolution go to in a world where we're literally becoming plastic, right? To put it bluntly, right, there's now studies that say that even our reproductive organs have microplastics in them now, right? Which you can look it up on Google. I'm not going to look up microplastics testicles on my computer in class because I don't want to do that. But I know it has been a study, right, that has been done. So like even this question of plasticity, right, and reproduction that the story raises is actually a very real phenomenon in many ways, right? Which I think is particularly interesting to consider, right? Wasn't there also a story, and this comes back to the, wasn't there also, I read this, I don't know if the actual research went anywhere, so I'm going to put an asterisk on this. I think I read a story not that long ago where there was evidence that bodies degrade more slowly now because of the microplastics that are in our body, right? So it takes us longer to actually like crumble into dust, right? I don't, like you said, I'm not sure of the veracity of that, right? That's why we're in a literature class. We don't actually have to rely on science. We can rely on our imagination, and that's good enough. But so I don't take my word for this one, right? But I briefly remember reading about that. But just the fact that we can that I can say this, and some people in this class are like, yeah, that tracks, right? That kind of makes sense, is also demonstrative of the point that we're getting at, right? Of how plastic has slowly become a normal part of our world, whether we agree, whether we like it or not, right? Okay. One more thing I want to bring up. You actually see it on the page that Maeva, you brought up. But you see it throughout, actually. The distinction between nowhere and now here, right? That's brought up. I know, Liam, you brought that up in your review, right? Why is that kind of interesting, right? What the play on words here of nowhere and now here? Why might that be worth highlighting in this story? Right? Yeah, go ahead.
I follow this, but to be sure.
It's fine. Liam, do you want to take it up since you wrote about it? Why were you thinking of nowhere and now here? Why is that interesting?
Now here and nowhere are just reference to my mind loves just
Take a minute. It's fine.
between the illusion and reality, between illusion and the reality too. So it is nowhere in the religion.
Yeah.
There is now here in the reality.
Okay. I think that's a really interesting take on it. Does anyone want to add on that? Yeah. Okay. So let's play on that, right? The world, right, as we know it, technically exists, or at least the world as the characters know it, right, technically exists. It is a world that they inhabit and that they engage with. And yet, to bring up the first question again, right, it is an inherently artificial world, right? Or hyper artificial world, because we all technically live in an artificial world. But it's a hyper artificialized world. And so it's simultaneously nowhere, right? Distinctions between places have collapsed, right? What's real, what isn't, what's considered plastic or artificial, and what's considered real world has kind of collapsed as a distinction. Bye, Alice. And yet there's a firm awareness throughout the story, right, of being in the present moment here and now, right? Right now, here, right? You have to be aware of the present moment. Yeah.
That is talking about her story.
Yeah.
Cody. She really did the emphasis on this, that and nowhere and now here is only one word to the next her, because she just explained it that
Yeah.
The W and the H.
Yeah.
Didn't get.
You didn't get that? I'm looking for a particular. Do you have a particular passage in mind?
It's that story that what do you take over there? It's further down.
Okay.
Also painted the red flag between the W and the H, so it says now here.
Yeah.
Same as it says, nowhere.
I think it's kind of getting at what we were saying here. It's like it's pointing to the collapse of any kind of meaning, right? On the one hand, right, the entire world has been plastified, right? And so everything is plastic everywhere, right? When to kind of paraphrase from The Incredibles, which great movie if you have seen that one. If everything is plastic, then nowhere is real, I guess. No, this metaphor is collapsing on itself. Like, never mind. I was trying something and I immediately failed. Right, but what the word is getting at to like not make a joke out of it, right? Is that as society has collapsed, right, the distinctions between different places has also collapsed, right? So nowhere exists, since cities no longer have names, right? Places no longer have, countries no longer technically exist, right? What we have are like little settlements of people, but they're nowhere, right? And I think also the plastic, right? The fact that it is this eternal thing that will last forever, does solidify things in the here and now, right? It exists as it was when it was plastified, and will be like that until it kind of crumbles into dust, right? And so the very fact that it is turned into nowhere cements it in the here and now as well. I think that's kind of what the word is getting at. Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay. Sorry. Yeah, I tried to make a joke out of it with The Incredibles, and now I want to watch The Incredibles again. Okay. Anything else we want to mention about this story that stood out to us before we move on to the Willows? Okay. Yeah, go ahead, Aya.
Unreliable narrator in space, but I thought the writing is pretty
An example of why you would think that?
that
Yeah. Maps, yeah. Fair. So the dialogue, did anyone else feel that the same way? Yeah. Okay.
That feels very intentional because they are teenagers.
It's very hard to write a teenage dialogue.
Yeah. So it always feels no matter what, it pretty much always feels cringy.
Which, fair enough.
Yeah.
I sounded cringy. I still sound cringy as hell, let's be honest. But like, as a teenager, we all sound stupid. I'm sorry, like that's just how we sound, right?
Yeah.
But I get what you mean, Aya, though. There's a difference between writing it well, right, in a way that's believable, and writing it in a way that's like that's a bit stilted. And I would tend to agree with you. Like the dialogue does tend to have a bit of a blockage insofar as like being believable and interesting, right? Yeah. Is that what you were kind of getting at? Yeah. Okay. And it ruined the rest of the story for you, or did it ruin the rest of the story for you, or?
sort of.
Okay.
I thought there was a lot of potential with the unreliable narrator, especially in a case like this one, but I thought it was not explored the way.
Yeah. Yeah, and by just to come back to like other examples, whenever you're talking about making dialogue believable in some way, shape, or form, it's not the same thing as realistic, right? But it should fit in with like what we imagine that type of dialogue to be, right? A really good example of teenager dialogue done right would be in the writing of someone like Kevin Smith, right? Who, if you haven't seen any of his stuff, I recommend it, especially the early 90s stuff. Really great, but no one speaks like that, but it's snappy and interesting, right? And there is like an unreliable element to a lot of those things. Same thing with like a Quentin Tarantino, for example. And on the flip side, right, especially with teenage characters, a bad, unreliable form of dialogue might be something like Star Wars Episode 2, right? Or Episode 1 is when the teenager one happens. If you haven't seen it, spare yourself the trauma of seeing that first movie. It's terrible, right? The episode one, I mean, not the very first one from the 70s. I mean, like the one in 1999. Horrible. Absolutely terrible.
Right.
But like, it's technically realistic, right? Like people speak like children speak or teenagers speak, but it sucks because no one wants to hear that, right? Midzi, do you disagree with me? Do you like Star Wars Episode 1?
Awesome.
Okay. That's the most diplomatic way that you could have told me to shut the fuck up. That's incredible. Yeah, that's great. That's great. Really? Even the first one, like the very first ones? Okay. Yeah, like the first one in the 70s is iconic. After that, it's all downhill from there. Okay. It's okay. You're allowed to be wrong. I'm joking.
Well, the most recent ones kind of suck.
Yeah, they all do. It's fine.
Yeah.
I do. Yeah, there's a few. There's a few good moments. I'll give Star Wars that. There's a few moments that you're like, yes, that was nice. That was enjoyable. Lightsabers are kind of cool.
Everyone.
Yeah, everyone can agree that big shiny lightsabers all day. Nope, that's not what I wanted to do. Sorry. Yeah. Like I said, I didn't want to talk for super long about the Willows just because I think there's a little bit less to unpack with it than fake plastic trees. But I still think it is kind of interesting to discuss as a really strong example of how nature for a long time was depicted in fiction, right? You know, with the advent of the 21st century, you do have things like Kiernan's work that actively question how we engage with nature and what exactly well, to put it bluntly, right, the nature of nature is, right? Through things like what you were bringing up, Aya, with like unreliable narrators and things like that. Even if Kiernan's approach to the unreliable narrator is not necessarily the best, but you do have these active questionings, right, about how to approach the world around us. And the Willows does tend to make a more traditional distinction that was seen really throughout most of Western literature throughout the 20th and 21st, throughout the 20th century, certainly, where we have humans as firmly distinct from nature, right? And I think that Willows really gets at that because, as Mia, you pointed out in your summary, the basic gist of the story is two guys go down a river and trees make them go crazy, right? Like the very act of being in nature seems to have some kind of effect on them, right? As if they are separate from nature, right? And not an active agent, or as if nature itself were not an active agent in our own lives, right? So I do think it is worthwhile looking at, even if briefly, before actually getting on with other stuff in this class. Okay. So I'll ask the same question as I did with fake plastic trees. Is there anything in particular that stood out to you with this story? Right. We did mention a few things here and there before in the summary, right, that you should pay attention to, or that I thought were particularly interesting, but I'm curious what you thought, if there was anything that stood out to you as worthwhile in the Willows. Right? Yes, Minhee.
That is like,
Yeah.
there are a lot of descriptions, but at the same time, there were like descriptions for what felt like was important.
Okay. So, do you want to elaborate on that? Do you have an example?
The Willows,
Yeah.
like it's very vague,
Mhm.
kind of old, like just talk about like sensation,
Yes.
everything, but that was it. Whereas they kind of talked about their surroundings or stuff in depth.
Absolutely. And by the way, your connection to Lovecraft is relevant here. Lovecraft would absolutely consider Blackwood to be an influence on him, right? He actively admitted that he loved Blackwood's writing and tried to emulate it. On the other hand, Blackwood absolutely hated Lovecraft's writing and would not give him the time of day. So that's quite funny. Lovecraft would be so influenced by someone who despised his writing, which I guess is all influence at the end of the day. But yeah, I think you're right. It does get at that vagueness, right? But again, but personally, I think that's a feature, right, rather than a bug necessarily. I don't know if you agree or not as a class, but I think that what Blackwood is getting at, right, is the similar thing. I think you're right, as what Lovecraft is getting at in trying to describe an alien thing, where to him these willows, which we've all seen willows. Do we know what willows are? Yeah. Okay, good. I could just pop up a quick image just to have it. Yeah. No, not the short story. Just willows. Yeah. Right. These kind of like weird, wavy trees. Well, so that's the thing, right? Yes, in a way they are romantic. I think this is like a photoshopped image or whatever, but I mean, good for you. That would be pretty cool, actually. But right, like they are rather for a writer like Blackwood, who's trying to set a scene. Despite this rather romantic picture, it is also an evocative one, right? If you want to make it rather horrifying. I don't know, looking at this image in particular, it kind of looks like a series of shrouds on branches, right? Like ghosts that are kind of hanging out in the branches. Like, I'm not a writer like Blackwood, obviously. I'm a writer, but not like Blackwood. But it wouldn't be that much of a stretch of the imagination to make this look horrifying, right? In my mind, and I think that's what he's kind of getting at. In making it a rather indescribable feeling or mood, much like Lovecraft would try to do. But I think he's more effective at it because it's something that we're all kind of familiar with, right? Lovecraft has the advantage of talking about aliens or cosmic creatures, right? Which we can all kind of agree are inherently, literally extraterrestrial, right? And alien to us. Whereas Blackwood, I think, has a more difficult task of making the familiar strange, which is what, of course, is core to the weird project. What else did we make of this story? Yeah, Mia. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Well, we had to not think about the creatures or whatever they were.
Do you have a particular passage?
A little bit.
Yeah. Yeah, there's kind of like a. I don't know if this is what you were going for, but what I'm thinking of when you say that is the classic idea of mind over matter type of thing, right? That in the face of whatever indescribable horror they're facing, reason, right, with a capital R, will prevail over them, over the horror. And in this case, would you say they're successful at doing that?
That's what I like accident.
Okay. Yeah.
Being on the full space. Also, I think I saw it more as like, if you don't think about it, it doesn't exist.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's like what I got.
Yeah, which is problematic in its own way, right? But not just from an environmental perspective, but just in like the problems we face, right? Which you should obviously face them, but kind of closing your mind off to them and ignoring them doesn't necessarily make the problem go away. But I think this is something we brought up last week with the Wendigo, Blackwood was someone who was rather personally critical of this idea of like reason, capital R reason, that was prevalent in 20th century mentality and is obviously part of the Enlightenment project, right, as a whole. Right, the whole Enlightenment project is predicated on the fact that humans are able to reason more than any other creature, right? And Blackwood himself would be very critical of this perspective. He, in his own life, would found societies that tried to get at understanding the world beyond mere reason, right? And I think you're connecting that. I don't know if you actually knew that about Blackwood or anything like that, but like, I think his story does try to get at that in some way, that even in the world around us, there are points at which unreason exists and that we have to acknowledge it in order to survive, right? Because otherwise you just kind of end up putting your head in the sand and not accomplishing much, right? And I think that's absolutely very good. Yeah, good. What else? Anything else? Maybe you can think of some of the questions that we put up on that I put up on the screen. We already kind of answered the first one, right? Is the nature of the story sublime, terrifying, or unknowable? I would say it depends, right, on where. The sublime aspect is sometimes, I think, interesting. There is a bit, there are passages, I don't remember on which page, where he gets at a kind of description of the Willows as closer to divine, right, rather than horrifying. And I think those passages are rather sublime. But then, of course, most of it is just unknowable horror. But I think the last question is rather interesting to consider, right? How might the main character's Western perspectives shape their fear of the unknown wilderness? For those of you who were here last week, you can maybe tie that into what we were talking about with post-colonial literatures or colonial literatures. Might have being right. It's actually something I brought up in the introduction to this class today. Mm-hmm. So one of the things that I was mentioning is how colonial subjects and post-colonial writers tended to explore, right, the non-human, right? And the reason why a lot of them did that is because a lot of Western and colonial writers, right, tended to shape colonial subjects as close to nature and therefore exploitable, right? That was one thing that we brought up last week and I reminded us of this week. And you do see some version of this again in the story, right? I don't think it's a particular coincidence, right, that Blackwood's characters here are European, right? Because he's able to write from other perspectives, of course. He did so in the Wendigo. But, right, the Western perspective that inherently sees, right, nature as other, right, and as a source of danger is something that we brought up last week, right? We don't know what's out there, right? That's part of the colonial mentality that that emerged and that encouraged actually the colonization project of places like here in North America. And even if this is not inherently a colonial text, right? That's not what I'm arguing necessarily. You do see a similar type of mentality at play, right? That sees nature in this particular way and frames it as horrifying because of these assumptions, right? That are at play. So I think that's at least something that we can consider in this case. But yeah, generally, did we like this story? Was it okay? Right. How many of you actually liked it? Ooh, that was like a okay. Yeah, this is why I didn't want to talk about it for super long, right? I just wanted to mention it as a kind of contrast, right? Because something like fake plastic trees. I will include it in the list of texts that you can discuss, right, in the exam next week. But I would be very surprised if anyone actually did, and that's totally okay. But yeah, again, I do think Blackwood is a particularly good example of what we would imagine as classic literature's approach, or quote unquote classic literature's approach to nature and to the environment, right? He takes it as a given, right, as this monolithic thing that is inherently the cause of non-human problems, right? Okay. Does anyone have any questions about anything at all from today's class? Or anything that anyone wants to add on anything that we mentioned? Okay, good. So I have already mentioned like what to expect for the midterm, right? But I did, just because it is next week, right? I do want to give you at least some time to ask me questions about anything you might have, either from what we've talked about throughout the semester or what to expect for next week or what you're allowed to, right? So just a quick reminder, you will be allowed your notes and all of that. It's open book, right? I'm not going to ask for things like passage identification, so it doesn't really matter if you have your books with you, right? That's not what I'm going to be evaluating. I'm more interested in evaluating your actual critical abilities, right, of these texts, right? Which obviously we've been doing in this classroom, but that's what I'll be looking at. Because you'll have open books, right? And a lot of the short stories I gave you were online, or I know some of you had digital editions of Lovecraft's book. I will allow you to have your computers and your iPads, but of course I'll be circulating. So, you know, if anyone does use AI or things like that, I'll know it. So just don't. And again, if you've put any kind of thought into this class, you'll be able to answer without the use of AI, right? So it really shouldn't be any kind of concern. Okay. Yes, AF.
Questions for which we would answer, like, for instance, like 3 out of 5, like we would pick the ones, or is it all?
Is that your question as well, Sue? Or
Questions like kind of format. So is it kind of like what she said? Like you give us a couple questions, you choose which we want to answer. Is it like essay format?
so there's going to be 3 questions to the exam, right? 2 of them are like short answer, right? I don't care about the number of words, but it's like 2-3 sentences per answer, right? The first one is a definition, right? I'm asking for you to define something. Guess what? I'm going to ask you to define. Perhaps it's something related to the topic of this class, right? Starts with a W, right? You might have to think about that hard for that one, but you know, we've talked about it for long enough. I'm sure you'll know. Yes, Adam.
I would assume that it will be a bit up to interpretation.
Yeah.
Depending on how we explain it.
Yeah. As long as you can justify the answer, right? That's the kind of thing. I'm not looking for a specific thing, but as long as it relates to stuff that we've related to class, right? Or that we've discussed in the class, I'm flexible on things like those definitions. The second question is also rather interpretative. And again, depends on like your perspective and your way of arguing it. So it's going to be, I'm going to ask you to actually not identify, but give me passages from the texts that we've read so far, right? And justify why they might be considered weird, right? On their prose level, right? So again, a bit more interpretation here. But the main question is an essay question, short essay, right? 500 to 600 words type of thing, right? So you'll have more than enough time. And like I said before, what I'm going to be doing is, but not what I'm going to be doing, what I've already done. I printed the exam out this morning before coming to class. I took one question from each of our theoretical perspectives, right? I put them in a list. And what I'm going to do is ask you to take one of those questions and apply it to any one of the texts that we've read in class so far, right? So for example, this is one of the questions, right? So how do characters relate to nature, right? So that's one question that you can choose if you want to as part of the list of questions. And you will have to apply it to any one of the literatures that we read so far. So if you want to apply it to Lovecraft's At the Mountains of Madness, right? So your short essay is going to be an answer to this question, right? In relation to At the Mountains of Madness, for example. Or if you want to take a psychoanalytic question and apply it to the Willows, I think there's something to be done there. You can do so as well, right? But again, this is short essay, 500-600 words. They'll get straight to it. And yeah, that's pretty much it. Does that answer your question, Ian? Good. Sue? Yes.
So I did a couple of the short stories, like first edition, because I was sick.
Yeah.
And is that bad? Or is it fine that I've read like most of them at least?
If you look, you will be able to apply all of the questions to any of the texts,
Okay.
right? So that's why I'm giving you like a grab bag of questions, right? So that in cases like yourself, where obviously I don't expect you to have read every single thing, right? Because you have other classes to do, right? And I know you have lives outside of this classroom. So you should be able to do the exam even if you haven't read everything, right? That's why I'm giving you options on what you can talk about. Yes?
So still the essay one
Yeah.
will be a name of one of the theoretical
Yeah.
aspects.
It'll be one of the questions that we've raised in class. Yeah.
How it can relate it to one of the texts that we.
Yeah. So specifically, I think I wrote down, I think I took 6 potential questions. You choose which one you want to take, and you apply it to any one of the texts that you think it's most relevant to you. Okay? Yeah.
It's sure like the thesis.
Yeah, I think that's fair. But again, condensed version. Like 500 words is more than okay, right? I'm not going to be a stickler on the actual word count, right? I'm estimating 500 to 600 words. If you want to write a little bit more, that's fine. Please don't go crazy, right? I know some students write like a lot of pages and are able to produce absurd amounts of pages in a short amount of time. You can stop after a while. You're not going to get more points just because you wrote 6 pages, right? What I'm looking for is actual arguments, right? Effective arguments rather than length. Okay. So yeah, 500 or 600 words is an estimate, but that's pretty much it. Any other questions? I'm being so generous with you on telling you basically what the exam is before it's arriving. So yeah. Yeah. Mhm.
Doesn't expect us to have a conclusion. Do you expect us to go with all the sorts of the essays?
I mean, as close as possible. To me, the conclusion is always the least interesting part of an essay, right? Just because and I understand why, right? That's just how you learned how to do it. What a lot of undergraduates end up doing is summarizing their arguments more than anything, which for the length that I'm asking you to do is not necessary, right? Like, I'm not going to need a summary of your points if I just read them. So if you want to write a conclusion, you can, but do something more interesting than a summary, right? That's what I'll say, right? But it's not what I'm going to be focusing on. Anything else? Okay, before you head out, I just wanted to mention real quick. So next week, of course, is midterm, March break afterwards, right? I'm correct in that? Yeah, okay, good. And then we're going to start talking about Kraken. Does anyone have their version of Kraken with them? Out of curiosity, I would have been very surprised, but do you? On your iPad, then never mind. I wanted the visual of it. It's quite a thick book. Has it, if anyone actually bought it at the bookstore, Adam, it's about 500 pages long, right? it is a fast 500 pages to read. I think Mieville's prose reads quite quickly, right? And also it looks thicker than it actually is just because of like the actual page margins and all of that. But you have like 3 weeks before we actually talk about it in class. There's a reason why I put it after the March break. It's to give you enough time to actually start reading it properly, because it is the longest text that we are going to be engaging with. So I do recommend that you actually start reading it now, just so you don't end up rushing through like 250 pages just for week 9, sorry. So I wanted to mention that. I would recommend you starting it right away. I will also mention, this is a bizarre text, even by the standards of our class, right? And what I mean by that is that Mieville is not interested in crafting a typical story, right? He deliberately plays around with structure and what we expect of it, or how we introduce characters and all of that. So it can be a bit of a whiplash moment when we first start reading it. So if at first you are confused about what's happening or what the story actually is, I would say give it a minute, right? It does kind of fall into place after a bit, but part of Mieville's prose writing is to put a lot of chess pieces on the board and then kind of tell you about it, okay, and put them in a clearer way. So don't panic, to quote Douglas Adams, The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Don't panic. You'll be fine. It's just not a typically written novel in that sense. Okay. Any questions about Kraken? Guess what it's about, just from the title. Yeah, exactly. An actual squid, by the way, that like you'll see the description at the start, that actually exists in real life.
The giant squid?
The giant squid, but specifically where the giant squid is in the context of the story, it's inspired by real events. So I guess that will actually make it more or less interesting depending on your perspective on it. I think it's more interesting. But don't hesitate to reach out to me if you do have any questions about the essay or about the exam, right? Or your reviews or anything like that. I'm still open to questions. I will be open to answering questions during the exam. I don't mind. But of course, I encourage you to send them before, just for your own sanity. Okay? All right. Have a nice weekend. I'll see you next week.